Hello again, people who probably also make bass music. I'm Annihilate, and for my second voiced video, we will be looking at how I go about making my basses in the wavetable synth SERUM. We will also look at how I process these basses outside of SERUM. We are going to go over two basses today, one a main bass and the other a growl. Here are both of them now. Now the growl. Let's start with the main bass. First, by soloing it without the sub and removing all of its processing. This is what it sounds like without it. As you can see, the processing is extremely important, but we'll get onto that in a minute. So first we're going to start off with a sine wave. Then we're going to press on this pencil icon and add 3 harmonics, which will give it more character than just a basic sine wave. Next, we're going to add in oscillator B, and we're going to choose the wavetable ICANN has kick. I have an LFO attached to the wavetable position on it, going up fairly high. That gives it its extra movement, and it's also attached to FMing, which we're going to be doing at 49% and 11%. There's also an LFO modulating the volume of oscillator A, and it is on 16th note, even though it says that it's on 4. It's just because the speed of it is being automated. Also make sure to keep oscillator B's volume at 0. Next, we're going to add in a notch filter. We're using the same LFO as before, with the notch filter set to 301 Hz and the LFO itself going at 15. This gives it some extra movement. Next, we're going to go into the effects tab. And first, we're going to add in a phaser. I have this phaser set to 100%, but it's being automated by a macro. You can use that to add more movement. The rate of the phaser is set to 0, with the depth being at 33%, the frequency at 372 Hz, the feed at 58%, and the phase at 0 degrees. Next, we're going to add in a hyperdimension with its rate at 74%, its detune at 76%, its mix at 0%, and these just being at default. Move the mix knob to wherever feels best to you, which probably isn't going to be too high because it gets very messy. Next, we're going to add in a distortion, with the drive being set to 25% and the distortions mix at 34%, with the same LFO on it going up 41. You might want to turn the drive itself up to get more aggression. Around 78% sounds good. Next, we're going to add in a Combs filter. With the cutoff at 90%, the resonance at 0%, the drive at 36%, the damp at 0%, and the pan at default. You can mix this in however much you want. Around 22% sounds good. Now we're going to add in an EQ and use it to add movement. From the frequency set to as low as it'll go, we're going to have it modulate from the LFO that we've used for pretty much everything else, going to 59, with the Q set to 48% and the gain just at default. If you're using a separate sub, this will end up giving the bass itself a lot more movement, or you can just use the sub oscillator with direct out. Now we will add in a slight bit of reverb. The size at 0%, with the decay at 0.8%, which is as low as it will go, with the low cut at 25%, high cut at 29%, spin at 25%, and spin depth at 20%, with the mix at 18%. But 18% seems to be a sweet spot. Finally, we're going to add in some multiband compression, leaving everything at default, I think. But just in case, the threshold is at minus 18.1. The ratio is at 4:1, with the attack being 90 milliseconds, the release being at 90 milliseconds, and the gain being 6.5. Also, as you can see, I have these macros set up to do different things just to help for automating in FL. With the Y value being hooked up to the Y value of the first LFO, you can just drag it onto it. The speed set to LFO 2, it's usually on quarter notes, but it goes up to 16th note. just to make things more interesting. And then I have this set to the phaser. Now for the post-processing, because we have to turn this into this. Let's start off with an EQ, which is basically just cutting the sub and doing a little bit to add the lows and the highs. Next, in Patcher, which is a default FL plugin, there's actually a disperser that's free. This is just a default disperser in it, just moving this knob thing down over here. Next, we have a wave shaper that is turning it up, doing a lot of saturation and probably a fair amount of distortion. That is very loud. Next, we have an OTT, which you can see all of the percentages here. Another EQ, doing the same thing as before, but since we've distorted it and used an OTT, we're cutting the sub again so that we can use a separate sub that's cleaner. Next, we're using a free plugin from Kilohertz, their stereo plugin, which is ever so slightly adding a bit of width to the sound. For context, if you don't have it, it starts off at 100%, and all that this is being set to is 122%. But this is still very useful for me. Next, we have a Maximus, which is basically OTT with way more control. But all that I'm using it for is to pump the bass up in it even more, as well as the mids and the highs. But also, it has a little bit of stereo control. If I was using something with its sub built into it, I would set this to be entirely mono and set the threshold here to be down a lot lower, around 100, because that then allows you to have a fully mono sub. But in this, I'm just adding a very slight amount of stereo width to the mids and the highs, which I highly doubt is even noticeable. Next, we have a compressor, which is just doing this, and a limiter as well, which is also just more compression. So we've got this to this. Now on to the sound that is probably much more complicated, the growl. We're going to start off with a sine wave that has a second harmonic here. Sounds like this. Very exciting. I'm using Remap with this LFO set to 71, with it just moved up a bit. This gives it slightly more movement. Now move over to Oscillator B, which is just a saw with the bend plus modulated up to 44. The unison on this is set to 2, and the unison on this to 3. Next, we're going to add in our filter, which is a bandpass 12, which is, and it's being used by both oscillator A and B. The cutoff of it is set to 40 Hertz, and it's being modulated with the same LFO as before to 32. The resonance is at 42%, and the drive at 83, and the fat at 28, with the mix up to 100. Next, we'll add in a separate sub, turn on the sub oscillator, set it to direct out, and its level is set up to 100. Then we're going to add in the noise oscillator, which is alpha noise, just set to 8%. Moving over to the effects tab, we're going to add in some hyper dimension with the rate at 40% and the detune at none and the mix at none. But the mix here is set to 14% on the dimension side. Then we're going to add in with the drive at 79% and the mix at 38% being modulated up with the same oscillator as before to 62%. Next, we're going to add in the movement of the growl with an EQ. The frequency is at its lowest, but it's being modulated with this LFO here, which is set to 66% with the Q at 22%, and the frequency here, and it's set to low EQ. Next, on this side of the EQ, we're using a high EQ, which I didn't realize that's what that was called, but the frequency of it is set to 444 Hertz, with 11 being modulated, and the Q at 60%, and gain at 3.2 decibels, and it's being modulated by 24. This is very important to add more movement to the growl. And finally, in the effects tab, we're going to add compression, which is just the multiband compression with the gain set to 12.2 decibels, and I think everything else is default. But finally, extremely important, you're going to go into the matrix tab and set an LFO to master tune. The LFO for this growl looks like this and is set to 19 or 18%. Make sure to tap on the little arrow here to set it to be facing both ways. Otherwise, it'll sound like this. Now you have the start to the growl, but the complicated part comes in through the post-processing. The reason why this is more complicated, in my opinion, is because of probably just this EQ. All that I'm doing is using 4 notches, as well as this band that's just lowering the volume of this area, and only bringing out these notches. It's not important where you put these at, and you can get some very different sounding results just based on where they're moved. Next, we have a slight amount of reverb that probably isn't doing much of anything. I have the low cut set to 1405 hertz and the high cut to 11.7, with the wet being at 31% and the decay all the way at the bottom and the size at 80. Now we go into an OTT with these settings. Immediately sounds much better. Then we have a destructor, which is set to harmor log, and all that I'm changing is turning the preamp up to 49%. Very loud. Then I decided to saturate it with a wave shaper, which will end up making sense in a minute. I ended up adding this after doing the rest of the processing. Next, we go into this EQ, which is raising up the bass as well as a little bit of the highs. It's then running into another OTT with these settings. Then a Maximus, which is doing the same thing as I said before. The lows, I've moved this to be at around 100. It's compressing it a little, but it's also set to make the sub entirely mono. If I solo it and play, it sounds like this. Without it, it would sound like this. The mids are being made slightly more stereo and compressed, and same with the highs. Then it's running into its third OTT, which has this processing. Finally, a compressor, which is set to this. So we went from this to this. Alright, we've made it to the end of this video. Before you go, I did release a free preset pack for SERUM, so you can get that if you'd like it, and I'll put that in the description. And also, my debut album is going to release next Monday. And on your way out, please remember to do the YouTube stuff viewers are always asked to do. And I'll see you in the next one of whatever these are.